Thank you very much for that, Michael. I'd now like to invite out Tom for his 20-minute opening statement.
Well, thank you everyone for coming out tonight, and thank you, Mike, for that opening statement. It was very, very informative. I really enjoyed listening to you. As you can all see, the topic of tonight's debate is Christianity versus naturalism. Where does the evidence point? And of course, I'm defending Christianity to say that the evidence points to that direction. Now, we need to define what Christianity is first. And Christianity finds its origin in what's portrayed in the Gospels. Okay, so the most significant event of Christianity is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. As Paul said in 1 Corinthians 15, if Jesus did not rise from the dead, then our faith is in vain. In other words, there is no Christianity if Jesus never rose from the dead. Okay, so Christianity rests on the resurrection of Jesus. And what we know about it can be found in the New Testament. All right, but what's asking us is for evidence. And what exactly is evidence? Okay, evidence is that which grounds a belief and tends to prove or disprove something. In other words, if you go to court and you want to prove yourself innocent, you provide certain evidence. You provide documents, you provide an alibi, eyewitness testimony to say that you were not guilty of the particular crime. So there's got to be evidence in support, but there's got to be evidence against something that's been said too. So I'd like to offer 3 arguments tonight in defense of the truth of Christianity. The first one, which you guys do not really have up now, but anyway. So the first argument, you guys can put it up, is that the New Testament documents are in fact reliable. In other words, what we know about Jesus today is exactly what was being said about Jesus in the first century. There has been no corruption in the transmission of the text. Okay? And the second is that the Gospels, the first 4 books of the New Testament that talk about Jesus, are actual eyewitness testimony. Okay? It was not written generations later. It was eyewitness testimony. And the third argument, if I do have time, is going to be the argument from Paul's conversion and his witness and what he talked about in the first century. So for my first argument, the New Testament is reliable. Okay? And my claim is as follows. We can know with an extremely high degree of accuracy what the original writers of the New Testament wrote down. In other words, the stories about Jesus that we know today are exactly as they were told in the first century. Today we have close to 6,000 handwritten Greek New Testament manuscripts all over the world, in libraries, we have it in museums. We have about 6,000 that predates the printing press. Okay? And scholars would agree that 95%, that if you put all these manuscripts together, they agree 95% of the time. So if we look at the next slide, we can compare certain works of antiquity to the New Testament. Okay? Aristotle, for example, as you can see, the distance between the original writing of Aristotle and what we have today, the earliest copy that we have today of Aristotle is over 1,000 years. You compare that to the New Testament, and you see that the distance between the original penning of the New Testament documents and what we have today is less than 100 years, the distance. And if we look at the next slide, which is very redundant, I don't know why I have it up anyway, it just looks really cool, you see the different comparison in the charts. All right? And now there's very important manuscripts that we have uncovered today. The first one is Codex Sinaiticus. Okay, that's a picture of one of the pages of that book that's been uncovered in the middle of the 1800s. And that book dates to the 4th century. Okay? And it has the entire New Testament in it. From the 4th century. And if we compare what we have today to that document, it's almost exactly the same. The next one is Codex Alexandrinus. It dates to the mid-400s, It has most of the New Testament with the exception of 23 chapters in Matthew and some verses missing in John and 2 Corinthians, but the New Testament's been virtually intact. And now the next one is the most important one, the important discovery of this century, well, the last century. In 1920, we discovered P52. It's a fragment of John 18, 31 and 33, and it's got verses 37 and 38 in the back. It's pretty much, I look at my Bible, my Greek New Testament today, and it's exactly as that P52 says it is. That's in England, if you guys want to go check it out. So what can we do? Let's say we take two manuscripts from the ancient times and we compare them. Okay, this is P75. It dates to about 175 AD, and this is Codex Vaticanus. It dates to about 350 AD. If you put them together, you will notice that they agree 93% of the time. 93% of the time. And so to recap, the first argument is that the New Testament documents in fact are reliable. They have not been corrupted as they were transmitted from generation to generation. They were preserved. The people who were copying them, the scribes who were copying them, knew the veracity of the content and decided to preserve as much as they possibly could. Now my second argument, the Gospels are authentic. The Gospels are actually based on eyewitness testimony of the purported events. All right? The second point is that they're actually based on memory. So I'd like to make a preliminary note before I go on, and that is, if the Gospels were composed in the first century, okay, just think about it, the Gospels were composed in the first century, then it is almost certain that there were eyewitnesses present at that time. Now, the Gospels, in fact, were written in the first century, and scholars both liberal and conservative would agree with that. Therefore, it is almost certain, and I'm being modest here because I want to say it's for sure, but it's almost certain that eyewitnesses of the purported events were alive at the time of the writing. So let's look at a gospel. Let's look at the Gospel of Mark, because I don't have much time to go through the whole, all the Gospels. Now we know that Jesus Christ was crucified in 33 AD. That's a fact. It's not disputed. 33 AD, that's when Jesus died. Okay, Mark's account was written around 65 AD, and New Testament scholars, both liberal and conservative, would kind of agree on that date, 65 AD. All right? Now, what I want to claim here tonight is that Mark was written based on the eyewitness testimony of Peter, who walked with the Lord. All right? And the first argument that I have to support that is an external argument from what Papias in the early 2nd century, who was born in the late 1st century, wrote about Peter. And I'm going to read what he says. He says, what became, and quoting one of the disciples who were alive at Jesus' time, he says this, Mark became Peter's interpreter and wrote down accurately, but not in order, all that he remembered of the things said and done by the Lord. For he, that is Mark, had not heard the Lord or been one of his followers, but later, as I said, a follower of Peter. Peter used to teach as the occasion demanded, without giving systematic arrangement to the Lord's saying, so that Mark did not err in writing down some things just as he recalled them. For he had one overriding purpose, and that purpose was to omit nothing that he had heard and to make no false statements in his account. So in the 2nd century also, Justin Martyr says that Mark was written on the basis of the testimony of Peter. So scholars disagree in various levels, and when it comes to Papias, when it comes to Justin Martyr, but what it seems to be suggested by what we know today is that it was common knowledge back then that Peter, who had seen Christ and walked with him, talked about those events, and Mark wrote them down. Now what about memory? Okay, because Mark was written 30 years after the crucifixion. Oh, sorry. I'm not going to get to that yet. There's a second defense for that. The second defense for the eyewitness of Peter in Mark, and that is a literary device called inclusio. And that's been used all throughout the 1st century, 2nd century, seen as late as the 3rd century, when an author is writing a historical event based on eyewitness testimony, that literary inclusio is always present when it's historical portrayals of events. And what that is if, for example, Lucian was a historian in the 2nd century, and he was writing about Alexander, and he used Alexander's buddy, his name is Rutilianus, as a testimony of Alexander. Now, Rutilianus' name, I know this is really complex, but Rutilianus' name is the first to appear in the account, the last to appear, and the one that appears the most because he's the eyewitness. Okay? Porphyry, in the 3rd century, writing about his teacher Plotinus, who's the founder of Neoplatonism, uses Aemilius, who was the closest to Plotinus, as an eyewitness source. Aemilius' name is the first to appear, the last to appear, and the one that appears the most throughout that account. When we look at Mark, we see the same thing about Peter. Peter's the first to appear, the last to appear, and the one that is named more frequently, by far, more frequently than any other name in Mark. And that gives us reason to suspect that Peter was in fact an eyewitness.